I will present today a number of recent work that's been doing in developmental robotics, and especially I'm going to discuss mechanisms of lifelong learning and their relation to the morphogenesis of developmental structures. Just before I enter into the topic, just a few words to the fact that many of the works I'm going to present are the joint work of many colleagues, both inside the Flowers Lab, which I head at INRIA and ENSTA Paris in Paris, but also the work of a number of collaborators who played a big role in those various works. So there is a particularly extraordinary thing in humans is that they don't learn a single skill. But a great variety of skills all along their lives, ranging from locomotion to constructing Lego structures to language, and such learning seems open-ended. Also, such learning experiences, they are progressive, there is a specific ordering and timing. The infant, for example, first learns to hold its head, then later on to sit, to crawl, then to stand on 2 feet, and then to walk on 2 feet. And even at that time, around 1 year old, it is much less efficient and more dangerous to try to do that than crawling, which they are already mastering very well. And still, they try again, and in the end, they eventually learn. So it's quite difficult to think that all these learning experiences and these orderings, they are pre-programmed in the genome in a sort of way. Evolution, for example, could not anticipate how to run bicycles or play with the iPad. So there is a fundamental question, which is how such developmental sequences form. And also in infant development, we know that there are regularities across developmental trajectories of infants. Like there are many stages that we see in many infants, but at the same time there is a lot of diversity. No two kids have exactly the same developmental structure, and sometimes some kids have very different developmental trajectories. So a big question is, which are the principles of change who drive such a morphogenesis of developmental structures? And the related question is to understand what is the role of this structure, of these orderings. Do they facilitate the acquisition of novel skills, or do they make it more complicated? So such questions, they are really at the heart of a domain called Developmental Robotics, which is the domain in which I am working, and where basically we use robots as tools to model and experiment various kinds of mechanisms playing a role in development. As I will also illustrate today, such research can also lead at the same time to the elaboration of engineering techniques that are inspired by the mechanisms of development in infants, and that make it possible to learn efficiently new skills when you have high dimensions, and opening the way to a form of open-ended development in robots. But to understand why computational and robotic models can be useful to understand human development, one has to realize that such development happens at multiple spatiotemporal scales. So on top of the cellular level, where chemical complexity is huge, you have the level of cell groups, then the level of organs, like the brain with billions of neurons, then the level of interactions between the body and the physical environment, and then the interaction with social peers. And finally, infant development also takes place within a process of cultural interactions, as well as within evolutionary processes at the population level. And all these levels, they interact not only from the bottom to the top, but also from the top to the bottom in a really bi-directional manner. I mean, like, for example, recently there has been advances in the science of epigenetics, where we actually now understand that experience can alter gene expression, which itself can alter behavior, and that this experience-induced genetic alteration can be transmitted to offspring. So, for example, that you have experiments that show that if you raise mice in a stressful environment, it will alter their genetic expression dynamics to generate some behavior in response to the stress. And then those alterations of the genetic dynamics will be transmitted to the offsprings, even if they are raised in a non-stressful environment. They will show those stressed behaviors, and this will again be transmitted to the offspring of the offspring. So it's really complicated. Development is really a complex dynamical system. And to understand it, we really need to go beyond reductionist approaches. We need systemic approaches. Because of this complexity, it is pretty hard to imagine how one could fully understand development only with observation and verbal theories, and without modeling and trying to reconstruct aspects of development with algorithms and robotic models. But why we should need robots rather than just algorithms and mathematics? Because I'm going to try to illustrate that in a number of examples. The body also, with its physical properties, plays a fundamental role in cognition. So, developmental robotics, as I said, has this goal of trying to model mechanisms of lifelong acquisition of skills. But just I would like to make a few comments about the term itself, developmental robotics. It is sometimes associated by some researchers to some kind of blank slate approaches when one tries to have machines that learn quite sophisticated skills from tabula rasa with minimal prior structure. But to me, this meaning or this association should rather be an oxymoron. It is not at all what I mean when I use the term developmental robotics. I would, by the way, say that many active contributors of the developmental robotics community today, they rather explore the legacies of Jean Piaget or Lev Vygotsky, which is neither innatist nor empiricist, but rather focusing on the processes of guided change of sensorimotor, cognitive, and social structures. And a central problem that organisms, natural or artificial, face is that they are basically embedded in a very large and complicated sensorimotor, physical, and social space, and they have at the same time severely limited spatial and temporal resources to discover and learn new skills in those large spaces. And a problem is that autonomous organisms, unlike many machine learning systems, they don't have access to very large pre-built databases for learning. They need to collect and build by themselves their own learning data. And this data collection requires physical experimentation and is hugely time-consuming. And so as a result, only a tiny fraction of skill that can potentially be learned by a given organism during its lifetime are actually learned given the time and space constraints. So it's basically impossible and hopeless to try to learn everything that's in principle learnable. Learning must be guided and rely on strong and potentially changing internal and external structures, forces that are going to guide development. And basically, infants learn thanks to several families of guiding mechanisms. And the modeling of those guiding mechanisms and the transposition of these forces in machines is basically what articulates research in developmental robotics. So, for example, among the different families that we can mention, and I will give several examples of work in some of them today. So, the first family of developmental mechanisms are related to what's called intrinsic motivation and active learning, which you may associate to the concept of curiosity in everyday language, which is basically those mechanisms that drive the organism in its active selection of the experimentation it's going to make sense of the world around. So it's a form of self-motivation. Then you have other mechanisms that are driving development, such as, for example, the building of cognitive abstractions, which are going to progressively abstract representations from low-level sensorimotor values to build spaces in which learning needs to operate, but at a coarser level of representation. And then you have mechanisms of social learning, for example, imitation, where social peers can be useful to guide the learner towards the discovery of particular skills. And then you have also mechanisms for guidance related to the body, the properties of the body, its morphology, its geometry, but also the way the body is growing with time. Okay, so I will basically begin by illustrating the study of some mechanisms, first related to intrinsic motivation and curiosity. And I'm going to do that in the context of thinking about the developmental acquisition of some families of sensorimotor skills. So I'm not going to talk about the acquisition of social or linguistic skills, for example, today, which is another topic we study. I'm going to focus on really the acquisition of low-level sensorimotor skills. So technically, the question I discuss here is how robots can learn the mapping between actions they make in given contexts and the effects it produces, as well as how to sequence or to compose actions to achieve goals. So this can be, for example, a robot learning how the airflow of its pneumatic muscle make it locomote, or how arm movements can make a physical object move, or how vocalizations or gestures can produce some effects on humans next to the robot. And so, in general, we model this problem by considering a space of motor controllers or a space of motor programs, which you see, which is the blue blob here on the slide, which is typically a space where motor programs consist of sets of differential equations parameterized by high-dimensional continuous vectors, and that basically implement closed-loop motor policies. And then you have a space of effects, which is the green blob on the right, which is also often parameterized by high-dimensional continuous vectors. So if we take an example, for example, the space of controllers might define a space of movement of the arm of a humanoid robot. And then the point here will, in this blue blob, will represent the parameters of this movement, which you can, for example, encode with dynamic movement primitive. And then the space of effect could be, for example, the translation and rotation of objects in front of the robot, and which can be pushed or moved by the movement of the arm. And when one tries to learn the mapping from the motor parameters to the effects, which we call forward models, we're going to manipulate either regression algorithms or algorithms to build stochastic models of this mapping. If one tries to learn the inverse mapping from goals to motor programs, we're going to use, in addition, optimization algorithms. And when we sequence and compose actions, then we will going to work with the reinforcement learning and structure discovery algorithms. But a big difficulty, a big challenge, is that those spaces in robots, they are going to be typically very high-dimensional, non-linear, redundant. And at the same time, as I said, there is very limited time for the robots to learn because of the time taken to do experiment in the physical world. And so this is especially a problem in the context of autonomous lifelong learning, because the robots, they need to collect their own learning data. If they explore the world in an unorganized manner, for example, randomly, they will collect very sparse data points that are very far away from each other. And even if you take the most advanced stochastic optimization techniques combined with very advanced regression algorithm, it will be completely inoperant. They will not be able to detect any kind of structure. So what's important is really to find mechanisms that are going to guide the acquisition of new data by selecting experiments. So among the guiding forces that one can study, one seems of particular importance, and yet pretty little explored scientifically so far. This is what psychologists have been calling intrinsic motivation, which is basically driving infants' spontaneous exploration of activities for their own sake, for the mere pleasure of exploring and mastering novel skills. So this is something that we call sometimes curiosity. This is playing a big role through all our life. It pushes us to discover, to invent, to create. It's probably one of the forces that led most of us scientists to choose our job. And basically the first psychologists to articulate those mechanisms, there are people in the 60s like Hull, White or Berline, and they argued that many instances of spontaneous exploration in humans cannot be accounted by basic extrinsic forms of motivations like drives for food, maintenance of physical integrity, or social bonding. They proposed actually that the brain may have also intrinsic drive to reduce uncertainty, to experience novelty, or experience surprise or cognitive dissonance. Quite recently, the notion of optimal challenge has been particularly studied, where interesting activities are characterized as those that are neither too easy nor too difficult. This is, for example, the work of Csikszentmihalyi. But most of this literature in psychology has remained so far rather vague on the precise mechanisms that are at play. I mean, those mechanisms, they're always described verbally. And so in a way that makes it a bit impossible to assess whether it could be actually working or not working. And furthermore, the role of intrinsic motivation in development and learning has actually been mostly unexplored. What is the consequence of intrinsic motivation on long-term development? This is still quite an open question. But yet, since a few years, some advances have been made. So, for example, as we describe with our colleagues from Columbia University in a recent review article in Intrinsic Cognitive Science that you can see here, there are really, on the one hand, several work in neuroscience that are beginning to identify neural circuits of intrinsic motivation and curiosity. And at the same time, in the last decade, there is a lot of computational modeling that has been conducted. So with my team in particular, we've been investigating many ways to model algorithmically curiosity-driven exploration, and especially how it can be made to work in robots. So curiosity-driven exploration is related to a spontaneous interest for novel activities, but not any kind of novel activities. With colleagues in my team, but also with colleagues in other teams, such as the team of Jürgen Schmidhuber, we realized that among the many possible mechanisms of curiosity, one is particularly interesting. So let's look a little bit in more detail. So in order to allow a robot to learn efficiently, models that allow to predict consequences of actions in given states, which can then be used for achieving goals if you use adequate optimizer algorithms. So basically the idea is that we can guide this learning by pushing the system to actively make physical experiments that provide maximal information gain. So this is what we call active learning. So here on the slide, you see the kind of forward model that the robot might try to learn. So S is representing the context, pi theta is basically representing the motor program, and theta its parameters. And then on the right, you see the consequences trying to predict. And so basically, when the robot is making experiments, is basically choosing values of theta, is basically making the experiments. And what he can compute after he's making a prediction is that he makes the action, he observes the result, and then he can compute the prediction errors. And the prediction errors, they can be measured after each prediction and used to guide exploration. And to guide exploration, we actually propose to introduce an abstract internal reward function, which is proportional to the opposite of the time derivative of the prediction error in the current state action locality. So basically, it means that the reward is going to be associated to practicing an activity which is basically providing a lot of learning progress. Basically measuring how predictions or competencies are improving. So this is the derivative, the improvement that is important in measuring the interestingness. Not novelty per se, but how you can decrease novelty or increase quality of predictions. And so if one uses an action selection system that selects action that maximizes this reward, this is going to push the system to explore parts of the space where its model is improving maximally fast. And we show that this automatically leads the system to focus first on learning easy parts of the space and then progressively more complex parts. So this is quite an original idea, actually inspired by theories of curiosity and intrinsic motivation in humans, but which is quite different from many other active learning systems in machine learning, because many other mechanisms in machine learning, they often use the reverse heuristics, which is basically, for example, prioritizing exploration in zones of the space where uncertainty is maximal. And basically this in general leads the system to first explore parts of the space which is pretty complex, and then finish where it's rather simple if you have time to just improve the simple. Here we do the contrary. We begin by the simple and we go to progressively to the more complex. But then beyond this general idea, there is a big difficulty, which is that in most cases there is no analytical models of this reward function. And thus, one needs to evaluate it empirically and numerically. So this is difficult since this function is intrinsically non-stationary, both temporally and spatially. So thus, in the previous years, we developed a whole series of algorithms for estimating it efficiently and usefully. So one way to do this in practice is with the following architecture, which we've been calling robust, intelligent, adaptive curiosity. So on the top, you can see a prediction machine, which we call here a prediction learner, which basically learns to predict the consequences of actions taken by the robot in given sensory states. So it's a very classical layer in robot learning architectures. But then on top of this learning layer and prediction layer, we introduce a metacognitive module, which is going to estimate the evolution of errors in the prediction of the lower level machine M in various subregions of the sensorimotor space, which you can view as modeling different categories of sensorimotor activities. And in each of those sensorimotor regions, the metacognitive module is going to compute and to assess how much learning progress is being made and use this measure of learning progress as an intrinsic reward, which is then going to be used by an action selection system, which you see on the lower left, to decide which actions should be made in order to do experiments in regions which provide maximal learning progress. But since you don't really know in advance where you might do a lot of learning progress, you should not spend all your time in the regions where you think you do maximal learning progress, but you should still use some part of your time exploring other regions. Maybe you could discover that there are niches of learning progress that are not yet discovered, but that you could discover. And so to balance this meta-exploration, meta-exploitation problem, we are using here bandit algorithm, especially variants of bandit algorithm that are adapted to non-stationary problems, as it is the case here. And finally, you see in the metacognitive structure that you have some subregions appearing. So the sensorimotor flow initially does not come pre-segmented into activities and tasks, but it's initially a big, fuzzy confusion, if you follow the words of William James. And so everything is the same initially for the robots. And progressively it's going to split and categorize the sensorimotor space in subregions by trying to maximize differences in learnability, which basically means rate of learning progress in various zones. And it is the way it's going to build progressively those sensorimotor categories in which it's going to evaluate learning progress, which is then used by the action selection system. Okay, so such a mechanism can basically automatically organize exploration. To visualize how, let's imagine an abstract situation where a robot is confronted with 4 sensorimotor activities, which have different learning profiles. So this is what we see on the top graph. So imagine there are 4 activities, and the robot spends a lot of time in each activity. First, it does a lot of time in activity 1, this is red curve, and we see that initially it's pretty bad at doing predictions, and it doesn't improve at all. Then he spends a lot of time in activity 4, initially it's pretty good, and it remains pretty good. And then activity 2 and 3, initially it's pretty bad, but it's doing some progress, but with different rates. And so if we use the architecture I just described to let now the system choose what activity to explore right from the beginning, but in that case it doesn't know in advance the shape of those learning profiles, then we should see that first initially the robot will sample a little bit the different sensorimotor activities, and then quickly discover that activity 3 is providing maximal learning progress at the beginning of its learning trajectory, and so he should focus more on this activity. And then at some point he will reach a plateau of learning, and activity 2 will become more interesting in terms of providing learning progress, and he will shift to this activity. And at the same time, he will constantly avoid to spend too much time in activities 1 and 4 because there is no learning progress to be made. So now let's look at one experiment which is a little bit more complex, which is with a real robot, and this is the playground experiment. So in the center here we have a little robot which is equipped with this curiosity-driven learning system. In the beginning, he basically knows nothing about his body and about the environment. So he has a number of motor primitives, but these are dynamical systems, but these are black boxes for him. He just sends in numbers and doesn't know what kind of effects it can produce. And he has a number of sensory primitives also. He can detect things like touches, sound, proprioceptive information in its mouth, movements of objects in front of its infrared sensors, but he doesn't know really the semantic meanings of those things. And so typically, initially the robot will begin by making disorganized movements, mostly randomly, but quite quickly it will begin to use only certain parts of its body at the same time. Then it will progressively begin to make movements in directions in which we know, as external observers, that there are objects. The robot does not know itself what objects are, we know. And we observe that it does some kind of actions towards objects. But initially we will do that in a non-specialized manner. So we just, for example, saw that at this point he's vocalizing towards the object on his left. The object that does not produce any effect. So this is what we say non-affordance. So now here we see that he is trying an affordant action, which is using its leg, and then it's produced some effects that can be detected by the robot. And so initially the robot does non-specialized action towards all kinds of objects, but then appears a stage where the robot begins to only use certain kinds of actions towards certain kinds of objects. So for example, this object on the left is playing with its leg, and then later on, for example, he is using its mouth to play with the little object in front of him, trying to grasp it. And then later on, he will shift and systematically focus in trying to vocalize while looking at the other robot who was pre-programmed to imitate the first robot when it is at the same time vocalizing and looking at the other robot. And so in this experiment, we observe basically several interesting phenomena. So first, the robot learns to manipulate objects in various ways, but the engineer did not ask it to learn how to manipulate these objects. For example, the engineer did not pre-program a specific reward function for learning how to grasp the little object in front of him. Still, he learns how to do that. This is an indirect consequence of its generic intrinsic motivation system, which is driving it to learn for the sake of learning. So then, another thing we can observe is that the behavior self-organizes into behavioral phases that are progressively more complex and which were not pre-programmed. And in particular, what's kind of stimulating is that after this discovery of manual affordances, the robot is engaging in systematic vocal interaction with exactly the same mechanism. Nothing changed. And so as such, this also suggests an intriguing hypothesis about how speech and language can be bootstrapped in infant development. Maybe curiosity plays a role that is pretty big. So I will come back on that in the next slide. And also, what we can note is that the self-organized trajectory that we see appearing is basically the result of the dynamic interaction between the learning system, the intrinsic motivation system driving experiments, the body and its physical properties, as well as the environment. And so this interaction is basically forming a dynamical system. And then, if we run the experiment many times, we are going to observe that there are at the same time strong regularities and a lot of diversity. So for example, some phases and sequences of phases appear very often in many robots, such as for example pushing objects with the arm before systematic vocal interaction. But sometimes some phases are reversed, and even some robots have weird, very different developmental trajectories. And all this happens with the exact same mechanism and the same parameters. And so the way to understand that is again to see what's happening as a dynamical system where each developmental trajectory is basically an attractor of the dynamical system, and you have a landscape of attractors with more or less big valleys. And we could make a link here with the notion of epigenetic landscape of embryologist Conrad Waddington. And basically the contingencies that are encountered by the robot, the little effect of history, can make it fall in one rather than another of these attractors, with more probability for the big attractors than for the small attractors. And this can explain this duality between regularities and diversity of developmental trajectories. So as I said, curiosity may play an important role in the bootstrapping of language and speech in particular. Very early on, infants play with their vocal tract, like they play with their arms and their hands, and also they play with their vocal tract producing sounds when they are alone, when no one is around, and much before they can understand the linguistic role of speech sounds and language in general. And actually, as scientists like David Euler have shown, they are actually exploring a wide diversity of non-linguistic sounds, especially before 6 months of age and the stage of canonical babbling. Such early vocal expression is also interestingly structured. So you have phases of various kinds of sounds like squeals or growls, which are now beginning to be well identified. But still an open question is, why is there such babbling, and how do these vocal structures develop? Again, curiosity may play a role. So we built an experiment where basically a vocal learner has been built with a physical model of the vocal tract as well as a physical model of the auditory system. And in between, we've put this system of curiosity-driven learning that I just described, which only goal is basically to do physical experiments that allow to maximize progress in learning to predict and control the dynamics of the vocal tract. And basically, in this model also, there is the possibility for the learner to listen to vocalization of social peers, which are models of adults around, and the learner can also try to target and imitate those vocalizations of the social peers, but he can decide whether he does this imitation or whether he tries to only do self-exploration. And again, he's basically using a measure of how much it is making learning progress to do this choice. And what we observe in this experiment is, again, self-organization of developmental structure. So within an initial self-exploration phase, we observe the following sequence. So first, the vocal learner discovers how to control phonation. Then he focuses on vocal variations of unarticulated sounds. And finally, it automatically discovers and focuses on babbling with articulated proto-syllables, like a bit what's the ma, ma, ba, 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 la, la, la of the canonical babbling stage. So this is really the order that we observe in most infants. And as the vocal learner becomes more proficient at producing complex sounds, and while initially actually it was not trying too much to imitate the vocal sounds of the social peers because it was really complicated for him and he did not make any progress, later on, after a lot of self-exploration, he has acquired the basic vocal building blocks that now allowing to make progress towards imitating those sounds. And this is why at this point he is now systematically trying to imitate the sound of the social peer. So there is a shift between self-exploration and imitation of vocal imitation of social peers, and this shift is not pre-programmed with a specific pre-programmed timing, but it is really a side effect, self-organized side effect of the mechanisms of curiosity-driven self-exploration. So here is a video of another related ongoing project that we have in collaboration with University of Paris 6. And so here we study basically about how an iCube humanoid robot can learn to recognize and differentiate objects in its environments, not only based on pure visual perceptual features, but also based on the relation between the actions it makes on objects and how it makes them change visually. So this is what people call recognition based on affordances. But what's interesting here is that the exploration, the experiments that are made by the robot to generate novel views and novel effects on the object so that it can improve its recognition, it is entirely driven by the system of curiosity-driven learning that I just presented. And again here, in another space, we were able to show how these mechanisms of curiosity-driven exploration can allow to structure exploration. In just a few slides, I will give you now examples of experiments in which we can not only measure how much this structuration is qualitative, but how much it allows to fasten and improve the efficiency of learning in high dimension. But just before I get to that, one little perspective about using those models in a qualitative way to explain open-ended development is that they allowed us to formulate a number of hypotheses which are quite novel about how humans are organizing and structuring their spontaneous exploration of the world. For example, when they discover novel sensorimotor spaces. And so now, in collaboration with Columbia University and a cognitive neuroscience lab, we are running experiments with monkeys and humans, where basically we put them in novel sensorimotor spaces which they have to discover, and in a context where they can actually freely choose to explore one of several of those new spaces. And those spaces, they have various differences in terms of their complexities and learnability. And so basically, we are right now running the experiments and to try to see if the predictions made by our models are going to be confirmed and allow to predict the structuration of exploration that is used by humans. So next results, maybe in my next talks. Let's come back to experiment with the robots. And now I'm just going to present a little update of the architecture I presented to you before. In the architecture I presented in a few slides ago, basically curiosity-driven exploration consisted in choosing parameters of motor programs, and to achieve them, And this choice of motor program was basically depending on how much it can improve the quality of the prediction of the local forward model. Basically, how you can predict the effects given some motor parameters. But then, this is potentially problematic if spaces are pretty large, because if spaces are pretty large, in the lifetime of a single robot, it will never be able to learn the full forward model. And the thing is that with robots, you have a lot of redundancies. Like, for example, you might have many parts of the motor controller space to produce similar effects. These effects, for example, can be produced by several different motor programs. And in the previous architecture, nothing prevents the system, for example, to spend its whole life learning 1 million ways to produce the single effect. But what we want in robots and what we expect of real organisms is not so much this. We would actually prefer that the robot learns to produce 1 million effects each time with only a few means. And basically to guide the system to do this kind of thing, and so to be more improving its capacity of control over the world rather than its capacity to predict the world, which is not always equivalent, then it is possible to, instead of choosing motor programs as experiments, to build an architecture which is going to lead robots to choose their own goals. So goals here are basically points in the space of effects, which are configurations of the environment which the robot would like to produce or to reach. And then once the robot has chosen a goal, he is going to launch a lower level optimization or learning system such that it's going to improve its skills toward this goal. But then the question is how to choose one's own goals, especially if the space of goal is pretty large, and especially if the space of goals might not be fully reachable. There are many goals that you could define mathematically that might not be possible to reach in practice. So for example, if you have a robot learn how to move its hand in a 3D space, initially there is no reason that he knows that he cannot move its hand in its visual space like 1 kilometer away from its body. There are physical constraints which make that it cannot do that. But it doesn't know initially. And so how to stop him deciding for goals which are not possible, and then to focus on interesting goals? Well, actually, we use the same idea as in the previous architecture. The robot is going to choose goals for which it is evaluating, it is making a lot of learning progress, a lot of progress in competence. And so it's going to progressively split the space of effects or the space of goals into regions. Like previously the space of controllers was categorized and splitted. Here it is a space of goals, and then it is going to monitor the evolution of competencies for various families of goals and to probabilistically select more often the goals for which he is making a lot of learning progress. And in practice, it will lead him to first explore in priority goals which are easy, and then once they are mastered, he will move progressively to more complicated goals. So here is an experiment using this kind of architecture, and which we use also to evaluate quantitatively the good performance of our algorithms. So we have a quadruped robot here which is learning autonomously the mapping between its leg movements and the movements of its gravity center. So the space, sensorimotor space, is 27-dimensional here. And this mapping is far from trivial, since it is used on a robot which has a lot of backlash in its motors, and it's also used on a surface in which there is a lot of sliding. So really the physical dynamics is complicated. And then during the exploration of this robot, we are going to test him regularly by asking him to realize the sets of independent translation and rotations. And what is learned during the test is of course not reused after in the learning. So this is really a test of capacities of generalization. And then regularly, this is the curve that you see on the right, we do those tests and we measure how much it is good at achieving those goals along with time. And so we compare, for example, in black you see what is happening when you do random motor exploration. You choose randomly motor commands. What you see in green is actually if you use the architecture I presented before, and you see it's actually not much better than random exploration because here the space is really very large. But then if you do curiosity-driven goal babbling, so you choose your own goals based on how much you expect to progress on those goals, then it becomes not only much faster learning, but within the lifetime of the robot, which is a few hours, then the asymptotic performance is going to be much better in generalization. So I'm sorry here that actually the y-axis is not very clear in terms of really the performances, but here it is really an important thing. Like in practice, if you do goal babbling, it's really going to allow the robots to do most of the physically possible translation in rotations that are possible after just a few hours of learning to locomote, which is surprisingly efficient. Like humans, they take several months actually to learn quadruped locomotion. This robot, without any kind of analytical model, learns quite precisely omnidirectional locomotion in just a few hours. So now we've also been thinking about how to combine those mechanisms of curiosity-driven exploration and learning with other forms of learning like imitation. So I'm going to give just you a little hint or sense of the kind of experiments we made. So one we developed an architecture which we call hierarchical curiosity-driven learning, which we call also strategic learning. And basically in this architecture, not only we allow the robot to choose its own goals, but we can allow also the robot to choose its own learning strategy. For example, it can choose whether it's going to explore a sensorimotor space by himself, self-experiments, or whether he's going to ask the help of a human teacher. And so basically we use the same idea to choose among strategies. The robot is going to measure how much learning progress each strategy is providing and then favor the one providing maximal learning progress. So for example, initially, the robot might begin to choose, maybe it chooses self-exploration, and then after it chooses this choice, then it chooses which goal is going to try to reach. But then if it chooses social learning, then there might be several teachers. So which teacher is he going to ask for help? Again, he's going to ask actively to the teacher for which he evaluates he can provide maximal information gain. Then once he chooses the teacher, the robot is going to choose how he's going to use the information from the teacher. The teacher, for example, might make a demonstration of a skill, but then the robot might choose, am I going to try to imitate the goal or to mimic the movement? Again, this choice is made by the same heuristic. So here is an experiment we made using this system. Here, the skill is about learning how to use basically a fishing rod. So I hope the video will launch. My computer now seems to be okay. So it's beginning a bit slow. And so you have a robot that is basically trying to control a flexible fishing can. So you have a flexible wire, but also a flexible stick, which is far from trivial. And here the robot is combining phases where he decides to self-explore how to control the rod so as to launch the float at any physical position that's possible. And then at some moments, the robot is asking for help to humans. We can produce demonstrations. And so what's pretty interesting is in this experiment is that even if the humans are not so good, and actually in this experiment, the human helpers were PhD students who are not the best fishers of the world. And so in general, they provide not very optimal examples, but still, even if the humans are not so good, the robot is able to reach a level of competence which is much better than either pure self-exploration or either pure imitation, and in the end he learned a skill that is actually much better than the human. And to understand why is that when humans show demonstration of the skill here, even if they are not very good, they are going to show movements with a particular structure which then the robot can pick up and reuse in some variations to refine and then manage to reach the goals you want to reach. And then so we build a number of experiments showing that this strategic learning can allow indeed the robots to be very efficient on a lifelong learning time scales. And I'm just going to finish by presenting a last experiment, which is the Ergo-Robot experiment, which was presented 1.5 years ago in a contemporary art museum in Paris. And as you will see, it was also a collaboration with some artists. The scenography of the robot was made by the movie maker David Lynch. You will recognize his style. And this experiment is about exploring yet another question, which is how a community of robots can develop a new communication system, a new convention for linguistic description of their environment. So this is related to research about how we can understand the formation of languages and linguistic conventions. And so basically, so this is the setup. You have 5 little robots in the center of a big egg. And those robots, they are going to be equipped with 3 kinds of learning mechanisms. One is the curiosity-driven learning mechanisms I just presented to you, where they are going to explore how to push and to move various objects who are around them. Then those robots, they can learn new movements from movements of humans around who can be perceived with 3D cameras. And then they can incorporate those movements in their movement repertoire. And then those robots, they will play language games, which is something that is based on the pioneering work of Luke Stills, which some of you may know. And basically in a language game, you have 2 robots. One of them wants to have the other one guess which object or which event around he is thinking about. And he is trying to use a linguistic label to have him guess what he's thinking about. And so basically, for example, he's going to do wabadoo, then the other one is trying to guess what it is, and maybe he's going to point to an object, and then the first robot will say to the other one, either, okay, this is the object I was thinking of, or this is not the object I was thinking of, and he will point to the referent he was thinking of. But then the issue is that the learner robot does not know what exactly is the meaning that is considered by the first robot, and so we'll have to make hypotheses. And so we will make hypotheses both about the meaning and about the association between certain linguistic labels and meanings. And then these language games, they are iterated many times among social peers in the tribe of robots. And what's very interesting is that if you do that let me come here, then we discover that some automatic synchronization and a linguistic convention gets formed and shared by all robots at some point. So here you see a little video, and I think now they are playing one of those games. And so here one showed an object, and he told him what he was calling him, and it seemed that here the other one agreed. And so they play those games many times. Initially, several robots will use different linguistic conventions, and then progressively they will self-organize and share a linguistic convention at the scale of the population.
Hi, I'm Steve Mahadro. Great talk, really very interesting. I was curious about the imitation examples. Is that emerging from your general exploration principle, or is that an additional principle to it?
So there are two experiments about this. In the playground experiment, the curiosity-driven learning at some point begins to engage in systematic vocal interaction with the other robot. But in that interaction, it is actually the other robot who is imitating the learner robot. The learner robot is, as a side effect of its system of curiosity-driven learning, entering this interaction, but it is not conceptualizing it in a way that we would like to call it imitation. So in that case, it is working like this. There is no additional mechanism. But then in the other experiments I talked about, like for example with the fishing rod or with the speech, then here it's different. Here there is the possibility to do imitation learning that is provided to the robot, but then the choice to use it and when to use it and with whom to use it is chosen by the system of curiosity.
Got it. Thank you.